So I'm going to talk to you today about rural community land trusts, so slight change of tact, and as I say, about the motivations of volunteers. So this is based, what I'm going to present is from a research project I did last year on behalf of Wessex Community Assets, which is a sort of secondary intermediary agency that helps to sort of support and promote community development. And they wanted to know a bit more about why do people volunteer their time in these initiatives. I'm going to assume knowledge in the room, primarily because of time as well, but suffice to say, CLTs are basically non-profit organisations formed and governed by volunteers to provide affordable housing for either ownership or rental in perpetuity. Development's largely been in rural areas. There's about 170 in the country. I think the stats that Robert put up earlier kind of showed that most of those are in rural areas. And in recent years, there's been a sort of framework of support and a supportive framework's grown to support their development, the role of the National CLT Network, local sort of regional intermediaries which facilitate development, and the role of housing associations has come to the fore as well. So that diagram kind of just illustrates what it is. CLT owns the land and usually sort of leases or rents the buildings on it, often housing to the users. The case studies I'm going to talk about sort of take a slightly different model because they work quite closely with housing associations. So basically they own the land and lease the land to a housing association who then provides the housing. But as I'll say, the CLT works very closely to design and deliver that housing. But it's a sort of slightly different ownership model, which is, I think, is important to say. Very briefly, in sort of what the study sort of entailed, as I say, it was undertaken last year. I did 36 interviews, 6 interviews per CLT, which was usually the size of each board, normally sort of 6 or 7 volunteers on each board, across Devon, Dorset and Somerset, which is the Wessex region. As you'll see, they're kind of very sort of diverse schemes, often with very different reasons for forming, not just to do with housing. So I think in Tullochgorum, for example, they actually wanted a new post office because the village didn't have certain amenities and facilities. And one of the only ways to actually get that and to sort of make that viable and stack up was to work with the housing association to deliver some affordable housing. So, and we've got some CLTs here who own sort of village shops as well. So a diverse sort of range of asset ownership and amenities within these case studies. So I'm just going to move on really straight into why do people volunteer really, and I'm happy to take any questions about any part of the study at the end or later on. And really it was built around these 3 themes about tackling localised effects of the housing crisis, about the value that people place on the sort of attributes of community ownership structures, particularly related to the way economically they work and also democratically. And then also really a bit more about trying to sort of rescale control of the sort of decision making over housing within their local communities. So, I mean, this kind of might be a bit of a statement of the obvious, but I think the sort of the quotes I've got might illustrate some of the reasons why CLTs form in relation to housing. So they typically form to tackle local problems of insufficient housing supply and affordability issues, aiming to provide housing that was more affordable relative to local incomes and to try and prevent sort of the displacement or lack of access that lower income households from their communities had to housing in terms of suitable or affordable housing. So I think the first quote here says, I just think if you don't have something like this, then there won't be a good mix of people. You need the mix of people to keep a village viable, really. So it's very much about sustainability of the village in terms of being able to keep amenities and facilities going as well. So, for example, local families were displaced and they were concerned about how the local school would survive in the future. You can have the village, but it wouldn't be a proper village, would it, if you don't have different ages and not being funny, different incomes, everything really. And this kind of related to the second quotation here, which this volunteer really bemoaning the sort of the affordability of housing, the fact that it was ridiculously expensive and that people on lower incomes were finding it very difficult to find accommodation. These volunteers were typically, I think it's important to say actually, are typically kind of retired, fairly well educated, former sort of people who worked in very professional occupations, but were sort of giving up their time to try and facilitate housing delivery in their communities, from which they would not directly benefit. The housing rooms, the CLTs I studied were allocated according to very strict economic and social criteria, Obviously, there was sort of an economic criteria and to do with income, but also a very heavy emphasis on local connection to the CLT's community, which was justified really on the basis of the fact that it was very much local people that they knew were unable to access housing. And by local connection, I mean, it kind of varied, the definitions varied, and they were usually worked up in conjunction with local authorities. But they tended to really emphasise past residency in communities, family links or employment links. There was also, as I say, moving on to sort of the economic and democratic value of community ownership in the study, and there was quite strong evidence about the fact that volunteers were both motivated and encouraged by the attributes of CLTs and the opportunity to try and hold land in trust as a common resource, which in a way could be used to sort of decommodify land and enhance the wider community. And this volunteer sort of said that he was very much motivated from a point of view of social equality. He didn't like the fact that money speaks for everything, and an opportunity to perhaps provide something or help to provide something in perpetuity that can help to balance out some of those inequalities was the main driving force for his involvement. And I think volunteers often, as well as you might have gathered from the previous slide as well, were very much aware about the gentrification of their rural communities that they'd sort of witnessed over living in the community, over their time living in the community. So they're talking really about where gentrification, where local people who are on lower incomes aren't able to find the housing that they need, particularly rented housing. And these were often communities where second home ownership was quite acute, where people might move to retire, and house prices were quite inflated and very overheated. And in addition to that, there was very rarely any sort of social or affordable housing output. So it's very much this idea about capturing the land value for local community. And some people spoke about the prospect of using the surpluses generated from housing and from land ownership to reinvest in other projects and other sort of community asset projects as well. CLTs were also very much seen and valued for being a platform for collaborative decision making and local input and guidance. I kind of wish I had Matt's quote about you hold the pen and we'll tell you what to draw, because I thought that summed up the kind of the sort of community input aspect of community-led housing quite well. And very much one aspect of it was about local accountability as well, in terms of the fact that local people were sort of in charge of steering and designing and the nature and type of housing, and it was just felt that there was a greater opportunity for local input. And this took both sort of formal and informal forms. I mean, obviously they held sort of very much sort of planning for real exercises where local people could come along and see models of the proposed development, see maps and drawings of local development. But also there was actually quite a lot of volunteers sort of said, and other people in the community as well, said that a lot of the consultation actually took place quite informally. It was over in the local pub or in the post office or in the shop, where people basically sort of had chats and conversations about what was going on with the new housing development, what was it going to look like, and fears and concerns were kind of addressed through that sort of informal engagement as well. And I think it was quite interesting as well that obviously in rural areas we often think about NIMBYism and people being very, very opposed to rural development. But actually, in some of the CLTs that I studied, it was often the neighbours of the site, the sort of selected development sites, which were actually the most active CLT members. And it was actually because when we think about NIMBYism, I think we often think about fear of change and very much sort of ardent opposition to development. But as I say in this sort of bullet point here, it was actually really about the mobilisation of kind of this emotional attachment to place, and it was the opportunity to have sort of leadership and advocacy over and control over the design, delivery and allocation of housing kind of meant that people who might ordinarily be cast as NIMBYs were actually the leaders of projects. So CLTs, as I say, were quite strongly concerned with helping localised, identifiable communities with their housing needs. The definition of what was local kind of varied, but it usually challenged or transcended administrative definitions and boundaries. And I guess an example of this is that housing associations might typically think of someone being local at a sort of regional level, whereas here it was very much about connections to villages and parishes. This quote here, I think, it sort of says, I was very aware that in setting up an institution which to an interesting extent, sort of has the liberty to redefine geographically what the community might amount to. And it reflected what we, the steering group, thought were the people who would regard themselves as being from Powerstock, which was the parish. And this emphasis on local connection was really justified on the basis that it meant sort of locally identified and observable housing needs that were unmet by other housing providers. And I won't read out this quote due to time, but it kind of really just sums it up about how CLTs were quite keen to help local people to stay if they wish to do so within their communities. This was also sort of, this very much emphasis on local benefit was also sort of inspired by perception and previous experience that perhaps private development of land in communities had failed to meet local need. By private development, I mean kind of private sector, but also that of sort of housing association, housing development as well, which has failed to sort of perceived to have failed to meet the sort of local needs of communities. I've got 2 minutes to go, so I'm going to skip to the final slide. So to kind of sum up very broadly, CLTs played a very important role in this project in facilitating the development of new rural affordable housing. They acted as local institutions with potential longevity. Many had already, but were also considering sort of extending beyond housing into the ownership of other community assets, which in turn actually brought new volunteers in who were motivated by, maybe they weren't too bothered by housing, but a new project. They thought a village shop would be good for the community, so they came on board to help out. So therefore, sort of helping the sustainability of their boards. I haven't really spoken about the house partnerships and housing associations apart from the introduction at the start, but essentially that kind of was critiqued by some interviewees for potentially compromising the transformative potential of CLTs, because basically the housing association gets a slice of the pie, a slice of the surpluses that might be generated from rental housing. But these partnerships were actually really important in overcoming barriers which were quite substantial, pressures on voluntary capacity, technical expertise and economic risk as well with projects, which was actually often absorbed by housing associations, and the CLTs as new organisations were either reluctant to or unable to sort of take the same sort of development risks. And then finally, some interviewees sort of played devil's advocate and questioned whether sort of the local connection and residency conditions were actually sort of introduced a new conditional way of accessing housing, and does this sort of narrowly defined definition of localness, how does this affect others who kind of lack those local connections? So some played devil's advocate in sort of critiquing that aspect of CLTs. So that's a whirlwind tour, and there's a report as well if anyone wants to read it online. And please stop now. So that's me.
Thank you, Tom.